Ad targeting goes something like this. You find yourself searching for a laptop. You look around on Best Buy for a little while, and then you start your history paper. You begin to notice every ad on the page is for new technology. This is a prime example of ad targeting. As techie guys ourselves, we began to notice this in middle school. Our memory and reason led us to see the pattern. Our searches were dictated by the ads. As we developed as thinkers through IB theory of knowledge, we began to question more about this topic. In middle school, we learned how ad targeting worked, but now we wanted to know the why. As we investigated this concept, we discovered something interesting.
Ad targeting is powered by large databases of your interests. Every search you make and site you visit adds to your interest indexes. Companies like Google, Facebook, and Microsoft track every move you make unless you disable it. This raises questions like, is it ethical, and should it be regulated? As we wrestled with this issue ourselves, we asked, is this new? Our knowledge question presented itself as, to what extent should advances in the natural sciences be bound by history? At the time of its inception, we were considering the idea that advances in science almost always outpace their regulation. The only concept we could use to evaluate them was historical precedent.
Ad targeting as defined by this presentation refers to electronic ads being targeted based on individual user ad data and personal information. This is different from demographic ad targeting, which is a concept from the human sciences. The technological aspect of gathering personal information and displaying the ads lends itself to the natural sciences.
We realized we had to use knowledge found in the natural sciences, history, and the human sciences, as they're affected by history. We also use multiple ways of knowing to find our conclusions, including reason, imagination, and language.
We formed our subsequent knowledge questions based on our historically relevant real-life situations. In regards to genetic engineering, we asked, how has the history dictated the discussion on human genetic engineering? We also asked in regards to net neutrality, to what extent should government regulation influence private business? Genetic engineering has advanced leaps and bounds since Crichton wrote Jurassic Park. We have now come to the brink of human genetic engineering, once only dreamt of. According to ABC News, the Institute for Reproductive Medicine and Science at Santa Barbara has now produced 30 babies with DNA from 3 parents. This raises the question, how has history dictated the discussion on human genetic engineering? Genetic engineering is improving at a rate that even the experts in the field cannot keep up with the monumental advancements being made. For this reason, the discussion on genetic engineering is best analyzed from the lens of historical precedents. In order to analyze the precedents found in history, a few ways of knowing had to be consulted. Language was the most obvious way of knowing. History has been recorded most consistently in language. Language is further removed than the other ways of knowing involved in this situation. When people learn history, they are often fed a particular perspective. For example, in the United States, I have been taught about the rape of Nanking, but I've also seen it called the Nanking Massacre, an incident in which mass murder and rape of non-combatant Chinese civilians occurred in World War II. However, the Japanese government and vocal Japanese nationalists deny that non-combatants were harmed, and that it's just a propaganda piece. While I don't speak Japanese, I assume they refer to it something like the Nanking situation or battle, rather than a rape or a massacre. This is because these words carry certain connotations which can change how we view the topic. Likewise, when describing the history of genetics, delivery can change one's perspective. Imagination is surprisingly central to this discussion. When discussing history's impact on the natural sciences, we often hypothesize the future because advancement is such an integral part of the natural sciences. The discussion on the natural sciences is largely dictated by fears of what could be, which requires imagination. However, imagination also inspires hope and drive in people who imagine the wonders that could be. Reason was also used because, frankly, knowledge is not possible without reason. I know that this is a very bold knowledge claim, which should be explored later, but I digress. When considering the knowledge gained from language and imagination, reason is necessary to deduce what knowledge means and what to do about it. Reason does have the limitation of being based on acquired knowledge. For example, if one is given false information and told to reason a conclusion, the reasoning can be perfect, but their conclusion is still false. I'm hesitant to mention this way of knowing, but emotion is also a relevant way of knowing in this case. As I mentioned, fear based on historical knowledge, be it true or false, and imagination has been a large portion of what has guided the debate on genetics. In order to understand this fear, it is necessary to empathize with others' fears. Emotion has also played a large role in the desire to seek advancement in genetic engineering, as people are excited by the possibility of human advancement or motivated by the desire of fame and fortune. And Edwin Hubble famously said, "Without ambition and without vanity, no one would enter a profession such as science, so contrary to our natural appetites." Now back to the topic at hand. Humans have sought progress since before recorded history. Whether it's in the strongest human stock, best weapons, or mightiest military minds, humans crave supremacy. Humans seek supremacy over all things, be it other beings or other civilizations. But now the time has come where we may conquer not others, but ourselves. Since Darwin first observed evolutionary processes and Mendel first suggested genes, man has sought to control this power to improve the human stock. Francis Galton, a cousin of Darwin, was the first person to suggest eugenics in 1883, or the selective breeding of humans to improve their genetic makeup. However, Plato may have beat him to the punch in his Republic. Genetic engineering seeks essentially the same goal, a human with more desirable traits. Dr. Palmer of the University of Louisiana goes as far to call genetic engineering the new eugenics. Proponents of genetic engineering see this history of advancement as a fuel for a continuing success story. This basis in eugenics has made genetic engineering a part of the natural sciences, bound in historical debate, which has slowed its progress. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, a large part of the history we have on this topic is passed by language exclusively. I must address the elephant in the room. The Nazi eugenics program has had the longest lasting impact on the debate of genetic engineering. The Nazis famously desired the creation of a purely Aryan race, which was to be created through the encouraged breeding of persons with desirable traits, forced sterilization, and genocide of the undesirable. The Nazis hoped to improve intelligence, athleticism, among other traits. Though their program was ethically questionable and based on scientific fallacies, opponents of genetic engineering often see this history with fear. Critics of genetic engineering will often ask, who chooses what is and is not desirable? The Nazi eugenics program also highlighted language's effects on knowledge. Since this program was discovered, the word eugenics has become somewhat of a taboo. For example, California had ethically questionable eugenics programs before the discovery of the program and the subsequent demonization of the word. History has inspired two reactions from the same two ways of knowing, due to different perspectives. These two reactions are generally due to imagination and emotion. Every individual's perspective on genetic engineering is based on their personal knowledge, which is built upon what they have learned. There are those who tend toward negativity bias and look at examples of eugenics being abused, such as the two separate laws in California, one which forced those on welfare or probation to surrender reproductive rights, and another which made the sterilization of the mentally handicapped compulsory. These programs were only stopped after the outrage of the Nazi eugenics program. People of this mindset allow emotion and fear to inspire their imagination, causing predictions of a grim future. On the other hand, there are those who will be inspired by the prospect of scientific progress, like myself. From my perspective, the history of abuse does not change my internal desire for progress. I tend to see experiments like the 1959 artificial selection study by zoologist Dmitry Mendeleev, which domesticated foxes to be biologically similar to dogs, or the creation of transgenic corn resistant to enzyme-blocking pesticides, as an opportunity to make the world better rather than the possible destruction of humanity. While this is partially based on my reasoning that these methods are more beneficial than harmful, I'd be lying if I said it wasn't largely an emotional response. I see scientific progress with a childlike giddiness, and I just have an affinity for it. Gregory Stock is like me in that he speaks on the possibilities of genetic engineering and looks forward to it. However, he also does note the dangers of the advancements in the natural sciences in his full lecture. He insightfully said, but when something is feasible in thousands of laboratories all over the world, which is going to be the case with these technologies, and when there are large numbers of people who see them as beneficial, which is already the case, and when they're almost impossible to police, it's not a question of if it's going to happen, it's when and where and how it's going to happen. Stock, as many invested in the idea of human progress, believes that genetic engineering is unstoppable, and I concur. However, the extent which history will limit the advancement is still debatable. No amount of discussion will stop the progress that's being made in genetic engineering. However, government regulation, a concept from the human sciences, has the potential to be influenced by the historical debate. Stock and I tend to fall on the right. We see hope for continued progress in history. We could spend hours in the weeds discussing the factors which lead us to see science with optimism, but we don't have that kind of time. Stock and I fall on the right, but it is a spectrum. There are those who will call for the full ban of genetic experimentation and those who will call for the full deregulation, but there are also those who will fall in the middle and see a need for compromise. Like Stock said, we truly cannot stop these advancements, but we can control how it's implemented. That discussion has led to regulation. The United States Coordinated Framework for Regulation of Biotechnology lays a broad permittance on genetic experimentation and disallows regulation unless scientific risk is proven. In contrast, the European Union's Committee on Environmental, Public Health, and Consumer Protection has enacted a policy of safety first, which makes producers liable if health risks eventuate. The Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, a coalition of 20 African states, leaves enforcement and specific regulation to individual states. However, due to Greenpeace and other NGOs spreading false claims to reinforce superstition and distrust, most have become hostile to any form of genetic modification. The work of these organizations really shows a limitation in knowledge. The organizations target weakness in knowledge to sway opinion. They distribute information which uses indigenous knowledge systems and confirmation bias, which further enforces emotions of fear, which then cause the reason in public policy to be based on a false claim, thus creating a system which is entirely based on alternative facts. History has made some people distrustful of intentional alteration of the human genome. This fear is not unfounded. The debate on the interpretation of eugenics history has caused the progress of genetic engineering to slow somewhat. However, this has improved the caution quality of what is done. While some states, particularly in Africa, have outright banned the practice, the protections set by other nations have not hindered the research and advancement of the science. The US and EU both only apply regulation to the application of genetic knowledge. As long as normal ethical guidelines are followed, no regulation has been placed on genetic engineering research in most of the developed world. So, how has history dictated the discussion on human genetic engineering? It has certainly prevented the application of new knowledge in the natural sciences, but all in all, it has not seriously impeded the acquisition of knowledge. Naturally, more relaxed ethics lead to faster advancement, but responsible scientists understand the ethical boundary. Thus, the regulation on human testing was already largely in place.
A second real-life situation we looked at was net neutrality. Net neutrality was a concept behind a law officially passed in 2015 in the United States. The idea was that internet service providers couldn't discriminate the speed of your connection based on what site you were on. For example, if you have Verizon, Netflix could pay Verizon, say, $1 million a year to make Netflix really fast and YouTube slow. But for now, the regulation is in place, preventing that from happening. The most current information on the topic is that the FCC chair is against the regulation and pushing to repeal it. There are many arguments about net neutrality everywhere. Some claim that the power should be with the consumer. Others say the internet is too big for any one government or corporation to make such decisions. Either way, the concept leads us to the question of to what extent should government regulation influence private business? And this is connected to the real-life situation because net neutrality is, of course, a regulation on private business. So we use several areas of knowledge to understand this issue. History, because it allows us to use historical precedents and examples to draw conclusions. Natural sciences, because these issues inherently take place with regards to technology. Human sciences, to discuss regulations themselves on science and technology. We also use several ways of knowing, including reason, to use multiple facts and ideas to create conclusions. Language, because one of the only ways to learn about history is through reading and studying documents. And finally, we have sense perception and natural intuition to make some generalizations about some data, but more on that later. So our first example comes from history. Back in 1903, the railroad was changing the world almost as much as the internet is today. Not only was it bringing people closer, it was revolutionizing transportation and communication in a new way. Perhaps the biggest problem with the railroad was at the time was that companies would offer huge discounts and special deals to large corporations. Usually these were rooted in some form of bribe, or often people that owned the railroad would often own other businesses and give discounts to themselves while leaving the common consumer paying full price. This not only hurt the American people, but also hurt small business, limiting competition, and keeping the large corporations who created the dynamic in power. Theodore Roosevelt changed all this with legislation. He pushed for the Elkins Act of 1903 and the Hepburn Act of 1906, where he campaigned publicly through the nation for citizens to pressure their senators to pass the bill, one of the first times this was done in U.S. history. The bill worked, and the price index dropped drastically, and the railroad saw much more use in further years. The pattern we see here is that the government had to intervene on behalf of the people in order to keep the railroad public and fair. We also observe that quality is improved even though business was slightly hindered. Our other example also comes from history. From 1960 to 1970, workplace hazards increased dramatically. There were 20% more annual disabling injuries than the beginning of the decade, and by 1970, 14,000 workers were dying on the job each year. Because of these pressing issues, Congress Congress passed the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970. The act created three institutions, most notably the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, also known as OSHA. The administration was in charge of setting and inspecting workplace standards. Perhaps the only people unhappy with the law were large corporations, who depended on poor working conditions to keep profit margins high. One of the biggest arguments was that the administration would essentially add too much red tape. To their credit, there was more paperwork necessary to sell goods. Regulations such as material and safety data sheets, which list possible toxins in sold substances, had to be submitted and approved. What history has shown us, however, is that business soared. As you can see, using sense perception, natural intuition, and mathematics, the GDP continued on its exponential curve. Also, workplace injuries decreased. We see these regulations didn't cause a significant detriment to business. The curve here didn't decrease. There's not a long-term trend that affected the economy after this act was passed. We see that government increased the quality of business, and workers received great gains. In both of these instances, we saw the government improving conditions for the general population, saving them from power abuse of large corporations, and net neutrality is no different. As we saw with the example of the railroad, without the government regulation currently keeping the internet equal, corporations would quickly abuse this power. And this is especially important in the natural sciences. Lawmakers making regulations about these topics may not understand the areas of knowledge they're making regulations about. So, to what extent should government regulation influence private business? It's difficult to say. From the few examples we've looked at, government involvement was good, but there are clearly several others where government involvement did create too much bureaucracy. So perhaps the only concrete observation we can make is that there must be a balance. Some cases are better for government regulation, others are not. We can see the general trend that regulation is necessary to stop corruption, but there are many facets to the argument, and clearly not every case is the same, so it's difficult to make a universal conclusion.
So now to tie this back all in, let us revisit our knowledge question. To what extent should advances in the natural sciences be bound by history? Through our research, we found that history should bind how we act, but not how we learn. The development on genetics highlighted this fact. Historically, the application of genetic understanding has received criticism and has since been regulated. However, the acquisition of this knowledge should not be stopped. Though many have protested genetic research, it has not been stopped, and as is clear by the rapid advancement in the field.
We also see that restricting this application is necessary because it can be easily abused. For example, with the argument of net neutrality, giving telecommunications companies the power to regulate internet speed gives them the power to completely change the public's access.
Our conclusion, however excellent it may be, does have some limitations. There are some issues which simply do not have a close historical precedent, such as human rights for artificial intelligence. Further, though there may be a precedent, circumstances change. Historical precedent may offer insight into a situation, but ultimately the decision must be made based on reasoning from the current era with all relevant information.
Another issue is that many issues have multiple perspectives. Some people would argue that companies should have little to no restrictions at all. Like in the case of workplace safety, they may say that capitalism can and should fix the deficiencies in the system. Clearly, some people may disagree with how the regulations, if any, should be made.
To generalize, the natural sciences should not be bound by history except in application. We came to this conclusion through reason. Reason allowed us to combine the knowledge we gained from language, imagination, emotion, and sense perception to create a comprehensive conclusion to our knowledge question.
But how does this all connect to ad targeting?
Well, ad targeting is not new. Marketers have targeted certain demographics for a very long time. However,
the problem comes when you apply natural sciences to the concept of marketing. Combining ad targeting and the natural sciences leads to questionable applications. Based on conclusions from historical precedent, large companies collecting large amounts of data demands regulation in some way.
This wouldn't be a TOK presentation if we didn't mention limitations, and even our question has those. While our conclusion is definite that history requires that regulation should be applied to the natural sciences, it doesn't necessarily include what those should be. That leads to the question, to what extent should the human sciences be guided by history? And more specifically, to what extent should the human sciences be applied to the natural sciences?
While we do not have time to discuss these questions, it's important to realize that in TOK, we shouldn't expect to find a definite answer. Also, in the real world, there are so many more factors at play than we can account for here. That's not to say TOK reasoning doesn't apply. This is just not the end. Now I know what you may be thinking. Government regulation is a concept from the human sciences. However, history has shown us that the human sciences should be consulted to regulate the natural sciences.
Which is why our question applies to this situation. To what extent should the advances in the natural sciences be bound by history?